I'm delighted to welcome people to the second of our webinars. I'm Leanne Beagley and I'm the CEO at the National Centre. And I want to start with acknowledgements. Firstly, the National Centre acknowledges country and the traditional owners of the land that we live and work on, and pay respects to elders past and present. We recognise and accept that sovereignty has never been ceded. And I'm on the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. Further, I would add that the National Centre is committed to ensuring that the voices of those whose lives are affected by the decisions that governments make should fundamentally inform those decisions. First Nations voices must be heard, raised and amplified through a voice to Parliament, and the National Centre supports a yes vote. We also want to honour the lived and living expertise of all victims and survivors of child sexual abuse, harnessing all ages, cultures, abilities and backgrounds, and commit to substantially addressing the harm of child sexual abuse now and well into the future. We recognise that there are children and young people today who are experiencing sexual abuse and dedicate ourselves to doing all we can to promote their effective protection and care. We just recognise that everybody who's here today is committed to working together to promote effective protection and care of children. Just want to remind you that our session's recorded. We encourage questions through the chat during the conversation, and obviously we'll get to as many as we can. We just want to ensure that you know who we are, and if this is your first encounter with the National Centre for Action on Child Sexual Abuse, it's a partnership between three respected organisations: the Australian Childhood Foundation, Blue Knot Foundation and the Healing Foundation. It was established in late 2021, so actually relatively new, following a recommendation by the Royal Commission into Institutional Responses to Child Sexual Abuse. So the National Centre's role is to commission critical research, build capability of workers and organisations, and raise community awareness to reduce stigma. And central to our work is elevating the voices of victims and survivors of all ages, life stages and communities. So welcome. We are keen to have you with us and to focus today on exploring the impact of technology abuse, jargon and language in the technology environment, and importantly, what parents, workers and others can do to mitigate risk with and for children and young people. And it may be the first of two conversations about this topic, as at the last minute, Dr. Michael Salter has been unavoidably unable to join us, and he sends his apologies. He's got a family illness. So when we get a chance, we will want to rebook and talk with Michael, who is the Scientia Associate Professor of Criminology at the School of Social Sciences at the University of New South Wales, and an expert in child sexual exploitation and gendered violence. And we do look forward to talking with him about critical and feminist theory, the study of complex trauma, with a focus on the intersections with technology. But we are delighted to have Detective Inspector Jon Rouse with us today. And he is a long-serving Queensland Police officer, 39 years of service with the Queensland Police Service. At Task Force Argos, he implemented Australia's first covert operation to proactively target child sexual offenders, utilising the internet to groom and sexually exploit children. He's led multiple national and international operations targeting child exploitation criminal networks and has trained law enforcement officers on online child exploitation investigations in Australia and internationally. Jon gained support for the development of the Australian National Victim Image Library, which is short-named ANVIL. That project was to assist police officers identifying child victims depicted in video and still images seized from child sex offenders. Jon's received numerous awards and citations for his dedication to fighting and investigating crimes against children, including the Queensland Australian of the Year Award in 2019. Jon, we're very honoured to have you. Welcome.
Thank you very much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you. And so I'm going to launch straight into a question. With a long career in the police force, working at the acute end of policing around child sexual exploitation, abuse and harm. Can you tell us a bit about where you first started out? Tell us about online abuse, or what online abuse and exploitation is, and perhaps give us a bit of a timeline about how it's evolved from the Kodak era to the present day.
Sure. So, as you mentioned, I've been a police officer for 39 years. I'm in what we currently call the departure lounge, which is just on long service leave, awaiting my final day at Queensland Police Headquarters, which is on May 19. They'll pipe me out of the building, and that will be the end of my law enforcement days. But I started my career in child protection in 1996 when I was promoted to detective sergeant. I was at the Gap CIB prior to that. And I was moved into the child abuse and sexual crime group, where I was dealing with the broad range of crimes that happen against children, not technology facilitated, but emotional abuse, physical abuse, sexual abuse, neglect, all the range of things that children are subjected to. In early 2000, and look, I guess I need to say at this point, I was a little bit of a geek towards the end of the 90s. I was building my own computers, I was upgrading my own RAM, I was installing hard drives. I did my first web page in 96, so I was coding HTML. So I had a really active interest in technology, which is probably the reason why I'm talking to you today, really. So towards the end of the 90s, we were starting to receive little bits of intelligence about the use of the internet by child sex offenders. Up until that point, and I hadn't started at Argos at that point, I was in the child abuse unit, but the way that Argos responded at that point was predominantly to institutional abuse or historical sexual abuse allegations. And Argos was initially formed to provide a response to the way that the institutions dealt with these child sex offenders. And as I'm sure you're completely aware, that response was generally to move them. And our state child protection units and investigators weren't equipped to follow this trail of abuse across the state of Queensland. So Argos was very heavily focused on those historical or institutional abuse allegations. Very reactive is the word I'd put you, and that'll lead to a story that we might unpack a little bit later on. But so I was approached by Detective Inspector Anne McDonald in early 2000. I guess she knew I was a little bit of a geek, and she said she'd like me to have a look at the threat and opportunities that the internet posed to law enforcement. This is very early days. We were dealing with 14-form fax modems. I don't know if you remember the sound of a fax modem dialing into the internet.
Yes, I'm old enough to remember that.
This is kind of the cusp of tape going into vinyl CD era. CRT monitors, desktop computers, no mobility at all, and and the technology that was available was for communications was really limited in those days. And you know what? I miss that era. I miss the era of a pager. Where you could decide whether or not you would then respond to. I don't know if anybody else remembers that era, but boy, it was quiet. The silence was deafening when you look back on what a pager was. But so, getting to your question about like the evolution, if law enforcement was to get involved in an investigation into the production of the sexual abuse material of a child, i.e. the actual capture of the moment a child was sexually abused, it was done on film. Another part of life that we've all forgotten about, where you'd come back from your holidays wondering what your photos turned out like, you'd drop them off at the Kodak lab and then have those god-awful screening nights where your parents would make you watch sit through slideshows. It was that's
about dinners in those days, did we? We just took photos of actual happenings.
Exactly. It's I don't know, I reflect with some reminiscence on those eras, but I also reflect with some dread. But so the way we would get involved traditionally was that film would be dropped off at a Kodak lab, and a technician in monitoring the quality of the prints would occasionally pick up the photograph of a moment that a child was sexually abused, and that would be referred to us for investigation. The other way that we received cases like this was from what we would call controlled deliveries, where Australians would be importing the hard copy publications of magazines that were produced containing the content of sexual abuse material, and those purchase orders would be tracked, referred to Australian law enforcement, and we would arrest at the point of the parcel being delivered. So this is very analog. You know, this is carrier pigeon days compared to where we are today. So the task for me initially, and a very small team, Argos, I think in those days had about 18 investigators assigned to the unit, and I was set up with a team of three or four. I recruited geeks, you know, because you wanted people that were happy to sit behind computer screens all day, and also had the aptitude to explore the evolving technology. But as I said, the only platforms that were really available were things like IRC, Internet Relay Chat, news groups, bulletin boards, and very soon after we started, MSN Messenger was launched. So immediately we started infiltrating some of the groups that existed on IRC. I set up a controlled operation and all of the way that we captured evidence. And it did not take us very long to be inundated by, we were setting up a couple of different types of accounts, you know, accounts as being young children or as adult offenders. And the accounts of young children were just inundated, absolutely inundated with basically online grooming. We made quite a few arrests for people that were actually sexually abusing children, and that was the way we started. And that ultimately, in the 19 years that I was at Argos before I moved to the Australian Centre to Counter Child Exploitation, which is where I finished up my final 4 years of my career, the reactive response of Argos in terms of the historical sexual abuse allegations, it stopped completely. And we became a completely proactive unit, and we grew up to a strength of nearly 40 investigators with intelligence support that was just solely focused on technology facilitated crimes against children. And like, there's a really good reason why we did that, which goes to that unpacking story, if you want me to kind of talk about that.
Please, I think it'd be useful.
Yeah, so I have spoken about this previously, because everybody has sliding glass door moments in their lives that are quite pivotal to, I guess, their destinies. And I was acting in the senior sergeant chair quite vividly. Still remember this, and as it does, the phone rang, and there was this extended period of silence at the end of the line after I introduced myself and said, you know, Task Force Argos, Jon Rouse speaking. Intermittent, some crying, some sobbing from the end of the line, which equally is not an unusual occurrence when you're dealing with people who are reporting sexual abuse for the first time. So after about, I think somewhere between 5 or 10 minutes of just saying, you know, it's okay, just take your time. Ultimately, this adult male in his 50s relayed his story to me, and you know, I'd love to be able to find him and have a conversation with him to tell him the influence that he had on my life. But ultimately, his story was that he was placed in an orphanage at a very young age, and the orphanage was run by a group of nuns. And on the weekends, there was a groundsman, and as a treat for the young boys at the orphanage, the groundsman would take them to the drive-in theatre. And at the drive-in theatre, he would sexually abuse these boys. And he was brave enough to report that this had happened to him, to the nuns. And his story to me was that they, and these are his words, they beat his feet till they bled. Because how could he possibly say such horrible things about this wonderful man that was trying to do something nice for these boys. And I couldn't help him is the short part of the story, because everybody was dead, witnesses, suspect, and it just left me feeling. It really gave me insight into the damage and destruction that the impact, lifelong impact, that this crime has on children as they develop and grow. And aside to that, that you mentioned the Queensland Australian of the Year and all those kinds of things, which are nice, but just kind of not relevant, but not important to me. But I had a lot of people disclose to me. I'm a musician. I've had musicians disclose to me because they've come to know of the work I do. I had an elderly resident at where I used to live, late in his 70s, disclose sexual abuse to me from when he was young, and he'd never disclosed it before. And all of these things just make you realize we are just so doing this the wrong way. We need early intervention. We need to get ahead of this. And that's what really, really drove me every single day. I've had other experiences along the way with Daniel's disappearance, with the Morecambs. Sonia Ryan losing Carly. Lots of things have affected me in my career, but we positioned ourselves fairly quickly to be incredibly proactive, and we built an incredible team of investigators at Argos that many of them that I started working with 20 years ago are still there right now on tools in undercover capacity, identifying and rescuing kids. So the ability for us to intercept the image of a child being sexually abused at the age of 18 months or 2 years or 3 years gives us the opportunity to remove the child from that situation, remove the offender from that situation, with the great hope that they'll never ever know what happened to them. They'll never remember that this happened to them. They'll have a chance at a normal life. And that's completely what drove the proactive response of the Queensland Police Service.
Can I just pause there and say to people that if you're finding it troubling to hear what Jon's talking about, which is really important for us to engage with, but we have been able to, and we'll get the team to pop into the chat, just support services that you can access, just watching yourself and how you take on board these issues, and noting, Jon, that those stories were the things that really triggered you to act and to be proactive as a self-confessed geek, to work in that computer environment. So as a non-geek, I've got some issues about how do we get ahead? How are things unfolding now? How are we seeing in this era, and how are police kind of getting ahead of that and understanding that? What's happening now?
That's a huge question. So technology has, and the use of technology and technology, people who develop industries around technology have raced ahead. They've embraced it, they've seen opportunities, and they've exploited those opportunities in a good way. There's so many positives. If they hadn't done what they did in technology, can you imagine COVID, the period when we were in lockdown? My wife, for example, is from Sweden. If we didn't have that technology for 2 years, she was locked down, she would not have been able to see or talk to her family. So there's good and bad things about these evolutions in live streaming and everything else that's happened. But we rapidly moved from that desktop situation where the technology was locked down, parents had some chance of supervising what their children were doing, to the rapid increase in uptake of mobile devices. With that rapid increase of uptake, parents lost that opportunity to maintain their supervision and observation of what their kids were doing. And in many cases, parents just completely fell off the technological curve and understanding of how their children were using these devices. The technology uptake in terms of communication platforms is really the thing that has now hit us. 2004, we had Meta, or Facebook as it was then, and MySpace come on board. I don't know if you remember MySpace. It was set up pretty much for musicians and band pages in the day, but that was one of the first social media platforms that was available, and people flocked to it. And Facebook slowly, or very rapidly, actually outstripped it. But in preparation for an industry event I was in yesterday, I remember 2 children in Victoria committed suicide and as a result, they put their posts on MySpace. That was 2007. They hung themselves, these 2 girls. So technology has been under the surface of this for a very long time. In 2011-12, we lost Amanda Todd, young girl from Canada. Her mum, Carol Todd, was recently in Australia speaking at our conference at the Gold Coast. That was, I guess, the first moment where we really had a global perspective on sextortion and bullying. It moved from the playground that every one of us that grew up at school has had some level of bullying happen. Well, once it became mobile and children were ganged up on 24/7, it changed the game. And in the instance of Amanda, she was sextorted. She produced content on demand. It was used against her, and ultimately she took her own life. And her mother encourages people to have a look at her video on YouTube. It's I don't know if you've ever seen it, but she holds up a whole. It's on YouTube. If you have a look at the Amanda Todd video, you'll find it. And I do encourage you to have a look at it. It's basically her story in place cards. And it's very powerful to watch, and that's why it's important probably to look at it, because it tells her story. So we've moved involved into this space where we've seen Instagram unpack and TikTok and all of the new applications that children have got, where they're influenced by influencers who are, I would suggest, not qualified to be providing advice to our children. We're seeing viral games happening, and we're losing children because of what that's doing to them. We saw the rise, a very, very significant rise in a strategy by child sex offenders that we call capping, which is capturing or screen capturing the moment. And the way that's kind of unpacked for us is that child sex offenders are very good at grooming. They're very adept at using technology against children. One particular instance, we had an individual who was pretending to be Justin Bieber. He socially engineered, we identified ultimately at Argos 157 child victims globally that he had sextorted, who did a range of horrible things to themselves, to siblings, and he would capture those moments that the children did this, and then he would use it against them. And they thought they were talking to Justin Bieber, but they'd get a backstage pass, that kind of. This is the vulnerability that children have with technology. That has now evolved into organised crime becoming involved. So you'll have seen the news that we're dealing with at the moment in Australia and at a global level. Probably everybody who's listening today has been subjected to some kind of a scam. You know, congratulations, you're the sole heir to $10 million, okay? Everybody is getting text messages from hijacked phone numbers, okay? And Australia is losing millions of dollars a year to these scams. Well, now they've pointed that at our children. So this is probably, if I can give you one really important takeaway from today, this is the one that I would want any parent, carer, guardian to take away, because it's the threat that we're really facing at the moment. And we can circle back on anything else that you want to kind of have a listen to. But the way this is kind of working at the moment, it's been going on, it's evolved from that 2017 case with a very similar methodology. Most of our kids are on Instagram. They're not really Facebook users, but they are on platforms like Instagram, they're on platforms like Snapchat, and they're on Kik. Kids generally like to follow influencers or celebrities or famous people. So a scenario would be 13-year-old boy follows famous, attractive golfer on Instagram, and within 10 or 15 minutes of following said famous golfer, young boy will receive a whole lot of account requests from very attractive young women. And those accounts will generally be along the lines of, hey, you're really hot. Let's chat and exchange sexy pics, that kind of thing. It's kind of a plug and play strategy that the scammers are using. Young boy sees pretty girl, engages, a grooming script is applied by the scammer. Ultimately, what we see is young boy produces an indecent image of himself and he shares it, and that is the end of the game. From that moment, young boy is then financially extorted and told, you give me $1,000. And these people are very smart. They've already looked right into young boy's friends, everything that they can find possibly on open source intelligence. They've got it all there, and they show the boy that they're going to send this image to all of these people. Lots of the kids are paying the money, and tragically, we are losing children to this scam. They're actually taking their own lives. So this point of the conversation comes down to your relationship with your child.
What advice have you got for parents about how they have the conversation with children? Is it about conversations? Is it about technology babysitters? What's the sort of advice you have for parents?
Look, probably the first thing I would say is understand the technology. If your child, we all give our kids phones. I mean, you want to stay in touch with your child. You want them to be able to call you if they're unsafe, all of that kind of thing. You're running late to pick them up from school or whatever else. But you need to understand that phone has got an incredible range of functionality other than being a telephone. So once they install all of these applications, and they will because all their friends are using them, and you'll make them a social leper if you close these things off. So my advice would be, sit down with your son or daughter or the child that you're caring for and go, can you show me what technology you're using? Make me understand it. Let me have a look at Instagram. Let me look at Finstagram, your fake Instagram account as well. Show me the platforms that you're using and show me how they're used. And then let's have a look at how the settings on them are set up, because a lot of the platforms do have security settings that can help protect them from some of these scams. So the first message for parents is understand the technology. Take an active interest in the technology. I guess one of the all-out bad things from COVID is that parents are really busy now. In most cases, both parents are now having to work. We're in the middle of a financial crisis. People are busy. They've got less time to monitor and supervise their children, and this is falling through the cracks. So that'd be my first piece of advice. Understand the technology. My second piece of advice should be a no-brainer. Make sure you're working on a relationship with your child where they will talk to you. They're not scared of you. That they can come and tell you if something bad has happened. Talking to our victim identification teams at Argos, 50 to 70% of the newly produced content that they're seeing is victim produced content. That's child in the sanctity and safety of their own home producing content that is ending up in the hands of law enforcement. That's a terrifying statistic. When you consider that when I started, we were focused on content that an offender was producing child. Now, children are producing the content on demand for offenders. And it's happening in your homes. So my daughter's now 27. If my daughter was 7, 8, 9, whatever, when bedtime comes along, my hand would be out to go, give me the phone, give me your iPad, give me whatever device it is that you use, and have a good night's sleep. And in the morning, I'll give it back to you. But a lot of parents aren't doing that. And a lot of this activity is happening while mum and dad are asleep, kids are in their rooms. So the other thing I'd probably say, Leanne, and I'd steer parents, go and have a look at the online resources that are available and educate yourself about that. Have a look at Julie Inman's page at the eSafety Commissioner. go to the ACE website. There's a wealth of information on both of those sites that you really should have a read and understand about what to do when this does happen.
Yes, we'll put those websites up at the end because they are incredibly resource rich and very helpful. So, and what about, so we'll get to talking about the responsibilities of the technology companies down the track, but what about where there are, children who have got particular neurodiversity, those with ADHD or with autism or some of those, or where the parents or guardians are not minding the risk for the children. So two sides of that coin, that where the parents are not the safest people, as well as where the children might be particularly engaged with technology, but unaware of risks.
Well, I guess the one thing I would say to you about that situation is those are the most vulnerable children on the internet. And what you'll see in the methodology of child sex offenders is that they will engage with 100 children. They'll PM, private message, 100 children. They might get 6 responses back. And those 6 will come from the children that you're talking about. The ones that haven't had that conversation, aren't skilled to understand what's going on, are incredibly vulnerable and perhaps lonely as well. They'll appreciate the special attention that this new friend is giving them. So you're talking there about a very vulnerable sector of the population of children that these people really focus on.
The second part of the question was about, as a community, how we protect children where the parents aren't the safest people, or where the parents are or guardians are somehow involved.
In terms of the use of technology, are you talking about, or just in general terms?
No, technology, I think, is the focus.
Yeah, well, look, that's going to be incredibly problematic, because if those parents, carers, guardians that are not the best people or not the most well equipped to provide a safe environment for the children, not in a position to have that conversation and monitor what they're doing, the only systems that are in place then are us. And you will probably end up getting a knock at your door from us at some point, because we've come across content, which is what's happening. And that might lead then into the responsibilities and roles of the technology providers as well, about what they can put in place. But ultimately, what I would say to you, the other thing to be careful of here is don't fall back on relying on, and there's a range of applications you can install on your child's device that's going to provide some level of safety. I would actively encourage parents to explore that kind of technology, and there's quite a range. I'm not going to endorse anyone in particular, but don't rely on that to be foolproof, because none of them provide 100% certainty and safety for your child. So that's not necessarily a solution.
I think we've skipped a couple of things by not defining sextortion.
Okay.
Be worth doing that, and then maybe moving to talk about the tech giants and what they could do.
Sure. All right. So the terminology of sextortion kind of falls into a struggle that we're having in what we're calling this content that children are producing. So everybody should understand the term extortion, where basically somebody has leverage over you and will use that leverage to get what they want, whether it's money or whatever it is. They'll extort you. The sextortion part comes in terms of the content that we're dealing about in the conversation today. So quite simply, it goes back to that scenario I explained a moment ago, where the active intent of the offender at the end of the line is to get sexually explicit content from a child. They want the child to activate their camera and produce content for them. What they will do then is they will capture that, they'll record it, they'll screen capture it, they'll film it, they'll photograph it. At the end of the communication with the child, in the early days, what they would do is, come back and engage the child a week later or a day later and say, can you do this again? No doubt, in many cases, the child has had second thoughts about it. And this is where sextortion comes in. The offender will say, well, if you don't, do you remember how you did this? And I'll send the image or the video back to the child. And so if you don't, then I'm putting this on the internet and it's going to go viral. I'm going to send it to all your friends. I'm going to send it to your school. I'm going to send it to your family. That's what sextortion is.
Thank you. Thank you. That's really helpful. And before I go to the tech giants, which I have flagged we should talk about, there is a question about how organisations and practitioners within organisations might respond to this new risk. Organisations that are working with children. What advice do you have for organisations in terms of protecting from this kind of online grooming, predatory sort of behaviour?
Well, let's just say, just remember, this behaviour has been around for a long time. So 23 years I've been involved with online grooming, with people grooming our children online. I would suggest for practitioners, for educators, for people who have a role in children's lives outside of the family, it would be, I would hope, to be monitoring the behaviour of the child, to know the child well enough to detect a variance in their behaviour. They become more withdrawn. There's a range. I think I can send you a list of about 15 or 16 indicators that I put together that everybody should be aware of in terms of variances in a child behaviour that could be indicative that they have been sexually abused or are being groomed or sextorted. So it's going to come down to your relationship with that child in those different institutions. I mean, if you've got responsibility for 200 children, you may or may not notice these things. But if you're a teacher, for example, I'm assuming you're talking about educational facilities here as well.
Yes.
Yeah. So remember, you're not going to see the physical manifestation of this. All right. And we should actually mention here too, Leanne, that, in terms of the actual physical sexual abuse of children, remember that the stats around that are 70 to 80% is it's intrafamilial, right? Mum, dad, aunt, uncle, brother, sister, and then it goes out in concentric circles of access to the child. So the indicators of actual physical sexual abuse, you won't see those with what's happening predominantly in the technology facilitated abuse of children. It's more going to be psychological.
Yeah, gotcha. So I think we understand that the technology platforms themselves have some responsibilities, and in terms of what they do, and you have talked about there are some privacy settings that can help, but they can still be worked around by people who want to work around them. Can you talk a bit about the problem and the extent of the problem in engaging technology designers and producers in this world of child exploitation? Yeah,
look, this really is, it's a key component of our conversation that we're having, and that we actually had even yesterday, which I can unfold a little bit about. But the internet is not regulated, okay? It's just basically just run ahead without control. And there's big dollars associated with this. Meta gets millions of dollars from advertising on their platform. But there's no regulation or control globally. And each country has different rules and policies and legislation. So we have a pretty incredibly complex environment about how we can regulate the internet for a start. But if you've listened to Julie, our e-safety commissioner, speak at any point of time, she's been an immense advocate for safety by design, which, I mean, that's pretty basic, isn't it, when you think about it? One analogy that gets thrown out is a playground. You don't just drop a playground on a pile of rocks. You plan how a playground can be designed and put together so that children will be safe. You see some horrible photos from back in the 70s and look at our playgrounds then, and you go, God, how did any of us survive playing on these things? But progressively, design came into play. Equally, you can't just go and build your own car and drive it on the road. We have regulation around motor vehicles that makes them safe. They have seat belts in them. They have horns. They have brakes. They have a whole range of things that keep other road users and you safe. None of that exists on the internet, right? Many of the tech providers have put things in place, and I have to take my hat off to Meta, to Facebook. They actually have got on Facebook very good security settings. The problem we have here is that kids aren't on Facebook. They're on other platforms. And also keep at the back of your mind, this is all about money. It wasn't too long ago that Instagram, which is a subsidiary of Meta, was looking at Instagram for kids. And we all just screamed and went, really? Do we really need Instagram for kids? Do we really need to set up a dedicated playground for kids that child sex offenders are going to infiltrate? Because there's no age verification. You can't use this unless you're under 13. Really, that's going to work, is it? We had this conversation yesterday at a big industry event that was hosted at the ACE that the Commonwealth Attorney General's hosted, and we had a lot of the big players there. And the conversation was focused very heavily on the problem I mentioned a moment ago around sextortion. What can industry do from the moment a child creates an account on one of these platforms that is a first step to making it safe? And one of the simple things they can do is, by default, having the security settings maxed, not minimized, maximized from the outset. I don't know if you use Facebook, Leanne, but I do. My friends list is not visible. Right? The vulnerability that law enforcement is advising the tech providers on is coming from the methodology that we're seeing the child sex offenders use. So I talked about that Instagram case. Young boy follows famous golfer, right? All of the sextortionists, and they can see that young boy has followed golfer, and then they can hit up young boy. How about you turn that off?
Yeah.
Okay. Little simple things that they can put in place that help try to protect our children. Why are kids allowed to have a profile picture? Make it an avatar. Snapchat it's an avatar. You can't put a picture of yourself on it. So why not on all of other platforms? Don't let kids have that option until they're an adult. Just little things that we have to stop. If I had another piece of advice for parents, please stop being their friends, be their parent. Okay. It's your job to bring these children up safely in the world. So if you're not having these difficult conversations with them about their safety online, other people will be having conversations with them. So the conversation with technology companies is a very complicated one. They were very open to our suggestions yesterday, which was really positive. It's the first really positive meeting I've had with industry. You may be aware that we have been having challenges with Facebook since they announced the implementation of end-to-end encryption. Now, a lot of people may not understand what that means, but I can try to simplify the issue for you. So Facebook is positioning the encryption of their Facebook Messenger platform, end-to-end encrypted, as a privacy concern for users. Once that stream of communication is encrypted, it will then end the use of a technology called photo DNA, pDNA. So all of that means is that every photograph that you send or image you share of cooking or your holiday pics on Facebook Messenger travels across this stream of data. And photo DNA is running in the background. Microsoft built photo DNA in about 2009. And it's analyzing those images, the unique hexadecimal string that makes up that image, and it's looking for illegal images. It's looking for images that are illegal because law enforcement has said that is child abuse material. That is one of the images of a child from 2009 that was sexually abused. We've said it's illegal. That joins part of the library of photo DNA that technology companies run across this string of communication. So if you're not sending child abuse material, you've got nothing to worry about. It doesn't care. Now, here's the kicker on this. There's an organization in the United States called the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, NCMEC. I'd encourage, we can maybe get a link for that too. They issued their 2002 impact report last week. In Australia, we receive reports from NCMEC. They're called cyber tips. We get about 30,000 cyber tips every year from NCMEC. NCMEC got 31 million cyber tips in 2002. 99% of those reports came from industry, reporting that their platform has detected
Issues.
a criminal violation. Yep. Yeah. About 80% of those come from Facebook.
Wow.
So as soon, and this is a fact, as soon as end-to-end encryption is implemented, 80% of the cyber tips that come to us that result in the investigation and arrest of child sex offenders will be turned off. Now, I don't know about you, but I'm not particularly worried about my cooking photo or my photograph of my cavoodle or my band playing or my holiday snaps going across Facebook Messenger. They're not looking at what I say. There's no examination of my text. It's just looking for that illegal image. And I don't consider that to be an invasion of privacy. I consider that to be due diligence and being a responsible tech provider.
Yes.
So that's one of the fights we've been having for about 4 years. That is coming. Meta have made it very clear that it is going to be implemented, and it'll happen probably this year.
So, Jon, I'm left with feeling a bit overwhelmed. I'm not sure how the rest of the audience is going, but we do have just under 200 people witnessing this conversation. So how do we maintain our hope? How do we trust that, firstly, that Australia's in the forefront of raising these issues and attempting to act on them on our behalf, but you know, as being part of the world of child sexual abuse, either those that are living with the impact or those who are seeking to prevent it. How do we maintain hope, and where do we put our active efforts?
Okay, so I think I've said this previously. There's always hope. Okay, I wouldn't have gone to work every day for 39 years if there wasn't hope, and hope comes from being actively engaged and trying to make a change. When I started in this work, and the image of a child being sexually abused fell under the Classification of Computer Games and Images Act. We had to take the image to the state government censor for it to be declared as an illegal image. Can you believe that? It took us until 2003 to get this under the criminal code, right? So that came from the active drive of Task Force Argos, a very engaged police minister called Judy Spence, who listened to us, and the legislation came in. So as long as you've got people across the spectrum of this issue, advocating, pushing, fighting, resisting, there's hope. You've got a world-leading e-safety commissioner who's consistently out there fighting. You've got, brilliant academics like Dr. Salter. You've got the Australian Centre to Counter Child Exploitation that is equally at the forefront. You've got a wealth of investigative capability in this country. You've got the AIC that are engaged. We have so many resources that are focused on this. There's hope, believe me. The battle we have is predominantly offshore.
Right.
Okay? And that's the fight that we're going to keep up. And even though I'm going I'm in the departure lounge into retirement, I'm not stopping doing what I'm doing. I only have to retire because apparently I'm old, and at my age I'm not allowed to work anymore apparently. But that aside, I'm going to keep doing what I do. But the battle for the 200 or so people that are listening is to take an active interest, understand that this is going on, do what you can do. Even if you do not have children, people that have children, Talk to their parents about this issue. Watch the documentary Children in the Pictures. It's still live streaming on SBS. Watch that documentary. I don't know if you've seen it, Leanne. It's okay. You go home and watch it. You won't see anything bad in it, but it will really tell you what we do. You'll understand what we do. There's a podcast for that documentary as well. There's another podcast called Hunting Warhead. Have a listen to that one. If you educate yourself and understand what we are seeing from the law enforcement side of things, my hope would be that you'll take a really proactive interest in the use of technology by your children. That's all that mums, parents, carers, guardians, educators, advocates can do, is talk to kids, take an active interest in kids, arm yourself with all of the information on those websites that you're going to post, and be engaged. Because if you're not engaged, what I can guarantee you is there is literally hundreds of thousands of people online that will engage with your child.
Jon, thank you. I will ask the team to just share that slide with the eSafety and ACCCE details so that you can see. So the ACCCE is, or ACE, is available for you to advise on suspected online grooming, an individual having a conversation with a child online and doing inappropriate things or trying to meet in person, live streaming and consuming child sexual abuse material, or coercing and blackmailing children for sexual purposes. The eSafety Commissioner can take down image-based abusive and illegal material, and can address cyberbullying of children and adult cyber abuse. So I'd encourage people to have a look at the resources that are available in both of those really important national entities. And just coming back to Jon and just noting that our time is coming to an end. Jon, can I just get you to reflect on, you've been talking for an hour, I know, and just reflect for us on just the take home, the key three things that you would like people to take home from this conversation. So and if it was me, I think it would be about make yourself this issue about educating ourselves about what's really there and challenging our fear about getting engaged or seeing and hearing things that are confronting to engage with what's being produced. Talking to children and talking to other adults about what the risks are, and making ourselves actively use the resources that are there. But what am I missing? What would you want people to take away from your talk?
Yeah, look, I think you've touched on important things there. Educate yourself. If you're scared of technology, there's plenty of ways to understand how technology works. If you don't know how Kik or Snapchat or TikTok work, it's really important that you understand. And there's a really other important reason for this, Leanne. If your kid is on TikTok, you need to understand the algorithm that TikTok is using to keep your child on that phone. Okay, every video your child watches, TikTok understands and then will steer content similar to your child. So there's huge dangers here around that. If your child is having suicidal, is interested in these topics around suicide, it'll start feeding them that kind of thing. So you should be aware of what the technology can do. So understand the technology, have the conversation. That's the critical thing to take away, is have the confidence to sit down with your child. And the eSafety Commissioner's page has got resources on how to have that conversation. As I understand it, Julie hosted a youth forum very recently. And one of the fascinating outcomes that came from that was that the kids wanted their parents to understand the technology. Pretty interesting.
Yep.
So those are probably the two really key factors that any of us could ask from the investigative, from the law enforcement side of things, that might help stem the tide. keeping in mind, you know, by the time you're having or your child comes to you, the damage is done. It's happened. Okay, you need to get ahead of the curve on that. Have access to your child's device. Right, you should. You're the parent. You bought it for them. Have access to the device. If they've got a problem with that, ask them why they have a problem with that. That goes back to my point about being a parent, not their friend.
Yeah.
You have to, because other people will get involved. The final thing I would say, Leanne, like if I was a parent again now, well, I am a parent, but if I had a young child now, is I would be putting very strict rules around the use of technology. I really would. Do you remember when the Pokemon phase came out, which still exists? I remember going to get my hair cut in the city, and I had to avoid this zombie apocalypse of people walking towards me, head down, face into their device, hunting invisible things. You know, this is humans using technology. So how about you try this with your friends and your kids? If you go out to dinner with your friends, everybody puts the device in the middle of the table. Everybody. First person to pick it up pays the bill. Right? Try that one, see how that goes. And with your kids, I'm sorry, devices are surrendered before bed. Yeah. Simple as that. Just simple as that.
Jon, I would like to be talking to you for another hour or two, and unfortunately we can't, although the way that you've opened this up for us and made it so accessible is incredibly welcome. Thank you so much. What a great contribution you've made, and hopefully continue to make, even though you're in the transit lounge. And you've reminded me how important geeks are, and what an important response can be, which is really educate yourself and understand what's going on. And my team will know how bad I am at technology, and how important it is for me to sit with my kids actually and get them to teach me and talk to me about, even though they're adults. Jon, thank you on behalf of the National Centre for your time. I know that this has been very engaging for people, and we hope to be able to have a second conversation with Michael to get a perspective from the research world about what he's learning through his research. Can I ask the team to just pop up the slides about the next conversations that we're having, noting that we will be having a conversation shortly on May the 25th with Dr. Kesselman from the Blue Knot, one of the founding members of the National Centre, and Paul Klotz about the experience of complex trauma and child sexual abuse through their lived experience. That will be I think, a really hopeful conversation, but a challenging one, and we hope you can join us. The one after that will be with another founding member, Dr. Joe Tucci from the Australian Childhood Foundation, talking with Professor Paul Gilbert from the UK about the role of compassion in responding to children who've experienced child sexual abuse. And the final one will be with Fiona Cornforth, who's the CEO at the Healing Foundation, our third founding partner, with Dr. Graham G and Professor Helen Milroy around creating and restoring safety for First Nations communities who've experienced child sexual abuse. We hope you can join us for those. We're deeply grateful to Detective Inspector Jon for his time today, and we really encourage you to give us some feedback on the survey so that we can make these webinars as accessible and as useful as they can. We thank you all for your time today, and thank you again, Jon.